Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is, and welcome. I'm Larry Erickson. This is the Erickson Report. And I've got an awful lot I want to get through today, so I'm going to plunge into it right now. I'm going to start by noting there have been any number of times when I have been distressed or depressed or upset by the road that our country, our society, the road that our future seems to be on. There have been times I've been angry, that I've been frustrated, and yes, at times I've been hopeful as well. But right now, I'm none of those things. What I am is frightened. I'm frightened because, as I said last time, our democracy is at risk, quite literally. Our ability to govern ourselves, to have a government, to use a phrase I'm sure you know, of the people, by the people, and for the people, is under serious threat. Now, there are two, if you will, categories of this threat, which they overlap a lot, so it's hard to disentangle them, but I'm going to try to approach it that way anyway, because one of those categories, if you will, is the attacks on voting, involving not just short-term manipulation and suppression in search of immediate gain, but also a long-term, ongoing attack on the very concept of voting as a means of governing. The other is an intensifying wave of attacks on our rights and civil liberties, specifically the ability to dissent from official stands and doctrines, to publicly question the status quo, to publicly seek justice. These are attacks. They are intended to delegitimize the notion of opposition, to make us afraid of raising our voices above the sort of private whispers to be found in the sorts of governments that Tweety Pie so much loves and wishes to emulate. Now, you may think all of that is overstated, but I intend to prove my argument. First, let's deal with voting. Last time I briefly mentioned the issue of voter suppression, the attempt to establish self-perpetuating reactionary control of government by limiting who is allowed to, who is able to vote. That, in fact, is how the racist, largely but not exclusively in the South, maintained their power for so long. They basically prevented black people from voting. By means including such as poll taxes, which are aimed at generally the poor, but black poor in particular, and literacy tests where the results were judged by the very same white racists who were using them in order to maintain their power. And if methods like that failed, there was always good old-fashioned physical intimidation and murder. The methods used now, they are more subtle, but they're still effective. A primary one, as again I noted last time, is voter ID, demanding an identification at the polls. These are laws which, by pure coincidence, of course, demand forms of ID that minorities and poor and students, which are three main groups that the right wing wants to keep from the polls, types of identification that these people are less likely to have. For example, in fact, in Texas, an NRA membership card is valid ID at the polls. A student ID from a University of Texas is not. These laws which could disenfranchise millions of people across the country it's invariably claimed, to prevent in-person voter fraud, which is where somebody shows up at the polls pretending to be somebody else in order to vote as them. The incidence of this is so vanishingly small that it is quite literally hard to measure. A study by Justin Levitt, he's a professor at Loyola School of Law and an expert on constitutional law. He did a study covering all elections, national, state, and local, from 2000 to 2014. That's something over 1 billion votes. And he found 31 credible accusations. No, not convictions, not even indictments, but 31 credible accusations of this fraud. And that's not the only evidence. The right wing Heritage Foundation maintains an online database of election fraud cases in the U.S., and even that shows fewer than 1,300 such cases and 1,100 convictions. That's over a period of more than 20 years. Revealingly, while playing up the number of cases, the foundation provides no information about the number of votes involved, which is probably because if you count only presidential elections, not state elections, not local elections, only presidential elections, presidential years, that makes about 30 630 million votes cast between 2000 and 2016. So 1,300 cases makes for a fraud rate of, at most, 0.0002%. In fact, studies by various researchers have repeatedly, insistently, reliably come to the same conclusion. Voter fraud in the U.S. in all forms is so rare as to be essentially non-existent. Even Tweety Pie's hand-picked Election Integrity Commission failed spectacularly in 2018 to sniff out this supposed massive fraud. And his own FBI director told the Senate Homeland Security Committee on September 24th that, quote, "We have not seen historically any kind of coordinated national voter fraud effort in a major election, whether it's by mail or otherwise." Now, that last bit is particularly important because this year mail-in balloting is going to be particularly important. And the same claims about rampant fraud, claims that the right wing has been peddling about voting for decades without any proof or truth, the same sort of claims are now being loudly and daily made about mail-in voting with the same measure of truth. Consider. Over the past 20 years, about 250 million votes have been cast nationally by mail. That same Heritage Foundation database shows merely 204 cases, 204 cases, involving the fraudulent use of absentee ballots over that entire time, only 143 of which ended in a criminal conviction. That is a fraud rate of, at most, 0.00004%. Meanwhile, Oregon started sending mail-in ballots to all registered voters in 2000. In the years since, there have been over 50 million votes cast in that state, leading to precisely 2 convictions for mail ballot fraud. That is a fraud rate of 0.00004%. Your chances of getting hit by lightning are more than 5 times greater. But then again, bogus claims of fraud are just that. They are bogus and they are lies. Even those making those claims cannot seriously believe them. They can't take them seriously. I mean, they may be fanatics, but they're not stupid. The claims of fraud are just that. They're an excuse. They're a tactic. Although I suppose, considering how long they've been at it, I should call it a strategy instead, but still. The point is, this has nothing to do with fraud. It has nothing to do with protecting the integrity of voting, and everything to do with undermining faith in the process of voting. Everything to do with destroying the very concept that voting means anything, that it carries any value. They, and by they, I mean the political right wing in this country, including the associated concentrated economic wealth and power, they want you to think that fraud is so rampant that the results of elections simply can't be trusted, so why bother? They want you to become so discouraged, so disenchanted with the very idea of self-governance, the very idea that it can function, the very idea that you can have a say in governance, get you to be so discouraged that you'll simply give up and leave the field to the reactionaries. And if they can't discourage you that way, they'll block you in another, such as voter purges, voter list purges. Voter list purges are supposedly merely a bureaucratic exercise in keeping voter rolls up to date by removing those who have moved or have died. Now, this is not intrinsically evil, but it's the fact that something has been weaponized as another method in order to control who gets to vote. To see why, first realize that minorities are disproportionately poor, and the poor people compared to those richer are more likely to be renters than homeowners, which also means they tend to move more, which already makes them a target of voter list purges. The problem, or more accurately, the opportunity for the right, is that such purges are often riddled with errors affecting scores of thousands of people who may not even know that they have been purged until they get to the polling booth and get turned away. For example, this year, Wisconsin is attempting to purge 129,000 voters from the rolls on the claim that they had moved away. only to have an independent analysis show that 38% of those people had actually moved within the same county by which they should not be taken off the rolls, and another 26% hadn't moved at all. They were still at the same address. Greg Palast is an investigative journalist who's been on the voter suppression beat for years. In fact, he was responsible for arranging that independent analysis in Wisconsin. As part of his recent book called How Trump Stole 2020, he goes into how and why voter purges became a favorite tool of the right wing, not despite the numerous errors, but because of them. Because even if the voter finds out, and even if the voter is able to correct the errors, it's very likely not going to happen before Election Day, so their vote is lost anyway. And even those are not all the means the right wing is using and is talking about using to deny people the right to vote, to be direct, steal the election for Tweety Pie and institute what amounts to authoritarian rule. Populist Jim Hightower lists a number of ways the right wing is trying to undermine the right to vote. That is, in other words, steal the election this time and eviscerate voting as a means of change in the future. In addition to what I've mentioned, Hightower has unleashed the lawyers, referring to the blizzard of lawsuits that are instituted against any attempt to make it easier to vote. Advanced thuggery, where he notes that a consent decree, which essentially banned most forms of voter intimidation, expired in 2018. Shut the doors, which is suppressing the vote simply by closing polling places, particularly in minority districts, or reducing the number of voting machines, creating incredibly long lines in minority precincts. Kill the post office to screw up mail-in balloting, and supreme suppression, counting on the Supreme Court to disenfranchise undesired voters. And to push these anti-democratic claims and try to advance this fundamentally un-American line of crap, no lie is too big, no hypocrisy is too great. You want an example? Here's one. You likely heard about those 9 Trump ballots were thrown out. OMG, the Democrats are stealing the election. Now, if all you heard was the headline, your reaction was probably along the lines of, what's going on here? Or if you're a Trumpster, more likely, I told you so. But go a little deeper. Read past the headline, and this is what you find. First, it turned out there were 9 ballots. Only 7 were for Trump, and it's not known who the other 2 were for. Now, exactly how they can know that 7 were for Trump without knowing who the other 2 were for, I can't explain, and I expect neither can you, except for the obvious conclusion that they do know, but just didn't want to say his name, because, after all, we can't allow for the possibility that screw-ups affect somebody other than Tweety Pie, because that would hinder the spread of, by God, they're stealing the election meme. Oh, and a quick sidebar, it was improper for the DOJ to announce an investigation this close to Election Day. It was also improper for them to name the candidate that could be affected by it. But of course, they don't care. Okay. Absentee ballots normally involve 2 envelopes, an outer one and an inner one. The idea is simple. The outer envelope contains the information to show that you are you and that you voted. The inner envelope contains your actual ballot. The idea here is that your actual ballot remains anonymous. That just gets taken out and put in a pile with all the other mail-in ballots that get opened on Election Day. And by the way, I assume I do not have to explain to you that mail-in ballots and absentee ballots are exactly the same thing. Okay, all right. What happened here is that apparently there were absentee or mail-in ballots coming in, and there were also requests for such ballots coming in. The envelopes look similar, and some of the ballots are opened by mistake, thinking they were requests for ballots. Now, if a mail-in envelope is open and the vote card is not inside the inner envelope, it's called a naked ballot. Now, the incident in question happened in a county in Pennsylvania. The ballots in question were naked ballots. In accordance with the procedure, they were not counted, because that's what's done with naked ballots. Okay, here's the punchline. Why were those the rules? Why don't you count naked ballots? Because the Tweety Pie campaign and the Pennsylvania Goppers won a lawsuit in Pennsylvania State Supreme Court saying that naked ballots should not be counted. So the Goppers are now claiming election fraud based on enforcing the very rules that they insisted on. But again, they don't care. They are transparent hypocrites. They don't care. They are transparent liars. They don't care. They are a disgrace to what it means to have a free society. They don't care. Nothing means anything to them other than maintaining their status and their power. But then again, don't think that mere hypocrisy and lying is as far as it goes. Don't think that voter suppression or purges or any of the rest of the things I mentioned is enough. There has been open talk in the right about two ways to simply ignore the election and literally hand the election to Tweety Pie. One is based on the fact that the Constitution leaves it up to individual states to determine how they will pick their electors to the Electoral College. The idea here is that states with GOPR-controlled legislatures would scream that there is fraud spreading through the vote like wildfire to the point where it is impossible to determine the actual will of the people. So we will take our authority to simply choose electors that we're going to send to the Electoral College to vote for Tweety Pie. The other is to use the 12th Amendment. Okay, here, first, right-wing goons said about creating chaos on Election Day and in the days leading up to it. Enough right-wing legislatures use that as an excuse to say that there's too much chaos, the election can't be held properly, the results can't be certified, with the result that no candidate gets 270 electoral votes. In that case, the issue goes to the House. Good? No, because in that case, each state gets one vote. Wyoming counts the same as California, Alaska the same as New York. Now, this does not mean that either of those two scenarios is likely, but the very fact that they're being seriously discussed, the fact that the right wing feels comfortable considering them, feels safe openly discussing how to literally ignore the results of elections, shows how far gone things are, how wildly power hungry the right wing has become as they sniff the possibility of perpetual governance in their hands, shows how great the risk is. Now, the battle I need to emphasize now is not lost. There are groups waging the fight in the courts. There are other groups doing public education and working on ways to make sure people can actually get to the polls. As individuals, the best thing we can do right now, the best thing we can do, quite simply, is vote. To not let them deter us, to not let them discourage us, to vote and to make damn sure it counts, which also means that if you're planning on voting by mail, do it ASAP. Do not wait a single day. And if you intend to vote in person, either early or same day, be prepared for a wait. Bring a folding chair, bring a book, bring a bottle of water, but don't be stopped. And I need to take a break. And we are back. All right, at the same time that our ability to vote is under attack, so is our ability to seek justice. This attack's been ongoing for some time. It's not a new thing, but it's really come to the fore during the ongoing demonstrations about police brutality and murders of unarmed black people. That's because rather than addressing the injustices, the racism, the militarization of police, the white supremacy that is the root of this, the right wing prefers to simply set about crushing the protest by means of increasing and in other cases outright creating criminal penalties with the idea of raising the risks and costs of protesting above what most people can bear. It's known as rule by law. This is a relatively new concept to be set in contrast to the rule of law, which is the abstract concept that we are all equal in the eyes of the law, which of course isn't true in reality, but we are talking about an abstract here. Anyway, the point is that rule by law means those in power weaponize the law as a means to maintain that power, and that is exactly what has been happening. Since 2015, in the wake of the protests set off by the police killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, states have introduced at least 154 bills or executive orders to limit protest. Now, a number of these are not directly connected to Black Lives Matter. In fact, some, including 3 just this spring, are all about protecting fossil fuel facilities because they don't want them no more Dakota Access Pipeline water protector protesters. No matter the target, all of these bills are threatening the same rights. In fact, nearly, if not more than 60 of those bills have become law, many of them since nationwide protests broke out over the murder, and honestly, I don't know what else to call it, the murder of George Floyd. As of June, more than 24 such bills were pending in state legislature. Now, I don't know what happened with a lot of them, but I know that at least 2 of them have passed. Like, here's one of the ones that passed. After Floyd's murder, protesters in Tennessee started an around-the-clock protest on Capitol grounds. After 2 months of this, the goppers controlling the state legislature and the governorship decided they'd had enough. Unable to buy off the protesters with mealy-mouthed platitudes about examining racial reconciliation, unable to crush them with repeated rounds of misdemeanor arrests and seizing their equipment, they simply decided to make protesting on Capitol grounds a felony, punishable by 6 years in prison and loss of voting rights. And in addition, a number of places aren't even bothering to pass new laws. They're simply repurposing old ones. Prosecutors in states ranging from New York to Utah have been using decades-old gang laws to go after protesters. That is, treating protests as if they were actions by criminal gangs. In Utah, adding a gang enforcement to a charge carries a sentence of 5 years to life. And yes, a woman in Utah was charged under that as a gang enhancement in August. Fortunately, the enhancement was later dropped, even though the underlying charge was not. There are more such rule-by-law measures coming. Recently, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis proposed a bill that would, among a number of other things, make it a felony to obstruct traffic, while also allowing motorists to injure or kill protesters as long as they claim they were fleeing a mob. It would make it a felony for anyone gathered in a group of 7 or more people, quote, to cause damage to property or injury to other persons. That is, if you're in a group of 7 or more people and any one of them causes any property damage or an injury, you can be charged with a felony. It attaches Racketeer Influence and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO, liability to anyone who organizes or funds a violent or disorderly assembly, which treats protests as if they were organized crime. And it also bars any state grants from any municipality that dares to cut the budget of their police department. A few days after that, Texas Governor Greg Abbott laid out legislative proposals to raise penalties and create new crimes that would mandate jail times for offenses committed during protests. This at the same time as state Texas cops are now spending hundreds and hundreds of hours to track down people accused of misdemeanors during protests. And of course, that's all the states. Don't think the feds are any slouches in this regard. In June, Attorney General William Barr, seen here in his weekend gig as a blobfish, said the DOJ and the Joint Terrorism Task Forces would together look at protests, quote, identify people in the crowd, pull them out, and prosecute them. This past month, Senators Rancid Paul and Ted Ooze called for the DOJ to pursue RICO charges against protesters and against Black Lives Matter. And Acting Department of Homeland Security Chief Chad Wolf said the department is looking into doing precisely that. A couple of weeks ago, Barr told U.S. attorneys to seek federal charges against protesters, including considering charging them with sedition, that is, with plotting to overthrow the government. The charge, which is in effect a couple of steps down from treason, carries a penalty of 20 years in prison. Shortly thereafter, by the way, Deputy Attorney General Jeffrey Rosen said, yeah, that's a good idea. We like that. And of course, there is the designation of New York, Portland, and Seattle as anarchist jurisdictions with an associated loss of federal funds, created out of whole cloth by the White House on the grounds that, when you come right down to it, the accusation is these cities have not been harsh enough on protests. They have not done enough to crush them out of existence, which is, for the right, of course, the only acceptable goal. Now, a key to this, by the way, a key to doing this, not sufficiently appreciated, is that it's not enough to simply punish dissent sufficiently to repress it. It has to be the right sort of dissent. You want to keep your opponents off the streets, but you don't want to hinder your supporters, even if they do get a little rambunctious from time to time. That is, you want them free to act so long as they are of use to you. Suppress left-wing dissent sufficiently, then gangs like the Proud Boys and the Boogaloos, they're no longer useful. Now they're a detriment, and they likely would be the next ones to be targeted. The point here is that for this to work, you need to redefine right-wing violence as self-defense in order to justify leaving them alone. Because the right wing, you can't regard them as violent. They can't be seen as violent, because otherwise you can't really use them as a tool. Consider, for example, Kyle Rittenhouse, who shot and killed 2 protesters in Kenosha. To the media voices of the right, with backing from the White House, he's not an out-of-state, outside agitator. He's not an out-of-state, heavily armed vigilante with dreams of Rambo. He's a hero acting in self-defense. The end of August, a group of right-wing thugs staged a pro-Tweety Pie rally in Portland, with a number of them driving through the central city in an obvious attempt at terrorizing people. There's a video of some of them shooting unarmed people with paintballs and pepper spray from the back of pickup trucks and plowing through crowds. At a press conference, Tweety Pie called that a peaceful protest and referred to paint as a defensive mechanism. Okay, look, I'm running out of time. Only got a couple of minutes left here, so I have to stop there. But I do frankly think that I have here done enough to justify my insistence that our right to vote and our right to seek justice are both under serious threat, and we need to be prepared for a struggle to protect them. So right now, going back to a couple of things that I have talked about. I've said this before, say it again. Oddly enough, just this morning, I read something about a question about, is this the most important election of your lifetime? And for a moment I laughed because I remember hearing, I can remember presidential elections back to 1956. And it always seemed that everyone was, this is the most important election of our lifetime. This is the most important election. Every single one was the most important election of our lifetime. The difference is right now, I think this one is the most important election of my lifetime. It's the one where our future is at the greatest risk. And I said, normally in presidential years, I tell people, if you're in a safe state, like, Massachusetts or California or Alabama, maybe, vote for a third party. Vote for a third party. But this year, no. This year, I'm telling people, even if you are in a safe state, I don't feel great about saying this, but I think it is the best course of action we have available. Vote for Joe Biden. Because I want Tweety Pie not only to lose, I want him to lose so big that even he can't claim that there's any faking. Get out, vote. Be ready for a wait. Like I said, bring a chair, bring a book, bring some bottled water. Don't let them stop you. Our future is too important. And I will since I apparently still have time, I will close with one thing. I mentioned last time, talking about the protests, said yes, there have been some violence at some of them, though apparently like 93% have been totally nonviolent. But I said then that we should have been surprised there wasn't more violence because of the frustration and the desperation that are being let loose here. And I have to tell you that I thought about that again, and I have to say that what we've seen, the destruction that we have seen, and yes, it has been there, and yes, it just shouldn't happen. But the fact is that what we have seen is nothing, no matter how much it's frothed over by a drama-addicted media. What we've seen is nothing compared to events like Watts 1965, Newark 1967, Detroit 1967. Those 3 events ended with 103 people dead, 2,400 wounded, and over $50 million in property damage. And we have seen nothing even vaguely approaching that. We shouldn't be surprised at the violence. We should be surprised there wasn't more. All right, that's it. I'm going to cut it off here. If you want to have any reactions to the show, my personal email is whoviating@aol.com, whoviating@aol.com. And we will see you in 2 weeks. Peace.